Okay, we just finished turn number 19 in the game, and right off the bat, the war will continue into turn number 20, which will be January 46, playing with the variable ending, so have to roll a 12-sided die at the end of each turn to see if the war ends or not. So we're going further. I think I rolled like a 10, and it needed to be like 1 through 4. So the war will continue into turn number 20. The Axis still maintaining the victory lead right now. Victory total, they still are at 13. So I still think that it's going to turn out to be an Axis victory, obviously depending on how much longer the game does go. The only chance the Allies really have is if the roll at the end of each turn just prolongs the conflict for, I would say, at least 3 more turns or so. The Allies have had some success here on turn number 19, but not enough to turn the tide at this point. So on the Russian front, the Germans had built up that fleet of transports and all those men that were sitting in West Germany. Now, they could have came over to England, landed there. London was probably too well defended, so instead they came over and landed in Leningrad, actually. And one guy got dropped off here in this Finnish territory bordering the Soviet Union, so they took that back from Russia, and they did successfully take Leningrad, but they lost all but one guy. So not sure it was worth it, but on the other hand, the Russians in that territory had 5 tactical bombers, 1 fighter, and 3 self-propelled artillery pieces. So in terms of the IPP value on the units, the Russians lost about 30 more. So I guess in that sense, it was worth it. The Russians, as you can see, then came back and immediately took Leningrad back. So the Germans did not hold Leningrad. Also, another thing, and again, this is a rule that I'm kind of confusing with Axis and Allies Global 40 as well as HBG's 39. So when you take a territory, at least I believe it applies to every nation. So if you take a territory from your opponent that has a major industrial complex or a medium industrial complex, you take possession, but it reverts, or it is degraded down to a minor. But then if that power takes the territory back, it automatically, the factory reverts to what it originally was. So in this case, when the Germans took Leningrad, that major factory became a minor factory for them, which they didn't even have a chance to use it. And then the Russians took Leningrad back right here on their portion of the turn, and now it's a major again. So I know in the past, other games, if you take a territory that has a major industrial complex, it is degraded to a minor. But then if it's recaptured, it doesn't automatically become a major again. So I'm not sure. I'm not really a big fan of house rules. I mean, some stuff can obviously add flavor to the game, but for the most part, I like to kind of just stick with the out-of-box rules. But that's something that I'm not sure I'm too in favor of, that if the territory is recaptured, it automatically, at no cost to that power, it automatically reverts back to what the factory was before. To me, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I mean, you would figure if the territory is captured in the first place, the reason why the factory is degraded down from, let's say, a major to a minor is because that territory and that complex has suffered, damage in the course of that battle for that territory. And now there's more damage, you would figure, to the factory when the power reoccupies that territory, and just at no cost to them, they automatically get to put a major factory back on that territory. To me, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I would figure that the territory has been so fought over and so much damage to that territory and any factory that would be in that territory that the power who recaptures the territory would then have to spend the money to put a new complex there. But again, at least for this game, we're playing with the out-of-box rules. So the Germans didn't even get the advantage of, taking that factory out completely from the Russians. Also, something I had done a couple of turns ago, because again, I was thinking along the lines of Axis and Allies 40 and Global 39 rules, is I took off the major complex in Kursk from the Russians. And then when they recaptured the territory, I didn't give them the major industrial complex back. So I've since rectified that. And I went back and gave the Russians the extra tech rolls that they would have had for having that major complex for the last couple of turns. So it didn't really affect things overall too much. Besides that, the Russians are kind of concentrating in several territories just outside of Moscow. So the Germans got a decent force in Kiev, and then they've got in East Poland a stack of about 20 mechs and about 15 self-propelled artillery. So again, I don't think either side can break through the other, just maybe some more like skirmishes. Maybe the Germans go in and take on one of these heavy stacks of Russian units, but then they leave themselves vulnerable to a counterattack from these other couple of stacks that are just outside of Moscow. So not even sure the Germans are going to do that. They might just stay with the status quo and just hold on to what they got, and because they are still in the lead, the Axis in general. They also went ahead and bought 5 new Stukas, so they've got significant air assets in West Germany. That's about 8 Stukas, 4 fighters. They also got 2 Fallschirmjäger. So Colonel General Kurt Student has got his first paratrooper forces on the board, and the Germans do have 2 Ju-52 transports ready to drop them somewhere. So they could possibly come over into Scotland, or maybe up here in Finland. Probably not in Scotland, because the British reacted by putting 4 infantry down in this major complex here. So now the England itself is pretty well defended from what Germany can bring over. Germany does still have the whole stack of transport, but really no units to bring over this turn. So that's things on the Eastern Front. The British, again, like I said, just simply bought some units. The U.S. actually pulled their fighters off of Maritime Air Patrol, landed them in London. So between the U.S. and the British, that's about a dozen fighters and about 8 infantry. So London's not in any danger. The U.S. bought a stack of infantry and more transports. So they've got about 8 men ready to come over here, probably into Africa this coming turn. In Africa itself, the U.S., another thing, again, I had taken off the minor complexes when the U.S. took these territories, so I've since put them back on there. They were supposed to. Again, that doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. If it's a minor complex and the territory is captured, I would think the minor complex is destroyed, but it's supposed to stay there, so the U.S. has got both of those minor complexes back. The British moved up. They got significant air assets in Cairo now. The Italians, now here was the dilemma for Italy. They only had when their portion of this turn started, they only had 1 land territory that they possessed, that they didn't own at the beginning of the game. And one of their victory objectives is to have 2 or more land territories in their possession for a victory objective. So not knowing if the game was going to end at this coming turn, obviously you don't do the die roll until the turn is over and the U.S. has completed their portion of the turn. Italy went ahead and took a chance and used their airborne infantry to spread out. They took Malta and they landed a few in some vacant territories here in North Africa, just so that if the turn did end, they would be able to keep that bonus of the 2 territories they didn't originally own at the beginning of the game. But then obviously they were vulnerable to U.S. counterattack. And then since the game is not now ending at the end of this turn, it was kind of a throwaway for the Italians with those forces. But again, they didn't really have a choice. They did buy a couple of airborne infantry this turn and a fighter, so they can move a couple more guys. But the U.S. is sitting in the med with some transports. The Italians only have a single territory in North Africa that's still theirs. That'll fall on this turn. So Italy's kind of getting boxed in a little bit. And with the U.S. having these significant forces in New York ready to come over, I think the longer the game goes, it's the Italians that are mostly in danger here. They don't have a lot in the way of income, and even Rome and northern Italy could be in danger from these U.S. forces in the Mediterranean. The Germans might have to bring down some of the Luftwaffe might have to come down into Italy just to help bolster the Italians' defenses, especially since the last couple of turns, that pretty significant Italian air force that had been built up has been pretty much decimated. So Italy's kind of just hanging on. Again, the longer this goes, the more danger for the Italians. In the Pacific, again, not knowing if the game's going to end at a certain turn now, countries are starting to take a little bit more risk just because they want to, if the game does end, they want to try to get in and take some victory objectives away from their opponent. So the Japanese continue to push into China. They've really taken a bunch of $2 IPP territories off of the communist Chinese. They really have Southeast Asia in their control, and a lot of the communist Chinese forces are left up in North China. So Japan continues to make headway there. They also put down a handful of subs. So they've got a decent fleet in the Japanese home waters, 5 light carriers, 4 light cruisers, about 6 subs, and a destroyer and some transport. So not too bad. And they continue to have some destroyers spread out, blocking the U.S. Force from reaching Japan itself. As far as the Far East Command, they put down another tactical. So they now have 4 tacticals, and about 6 fighters on the board. So they can actually start coming over and making some noise, depending on how much longer the game goes on. The Anzac bought a couple of destroyers, 3 total. So again, with no Japanese ships in the South Pacific at all, they're going to start coming out and making some noise. The Japanese did come down and they took out the Australian transport that was down here. So now these men are kind of stuck on that island, Dutch New Guinea. That was about it for the Japanese. And then the U.S. is here where we're talking about some chances being taken. So they kind of spread out. They brought some forces down here to Dutch New Guinea to back up the Australians. And that's 2 U.S. transports with 4 infantry, a fleet carrier, and about 4 damaged battleships. So again, they're in a position to start taking some of these money islands back that are completely defenseless. And the other kind of risk they took was by splitting up their fleet. They're over here, and they took Wake back, and that's about 5 damaged battleships, 2 fleet carriers, a couple destroyers, 3 transports with 3 tanks, and 3 infantry. Now, by splitting that up, the Japanese can come out from the Japanese home waters and probably take out either one of these fleets, not both of them. But again, since the U.S. doesn't know if the game is going to end at the end of a turn at this point, they want to take a chance, split up their forces, and try to get some of this money and some of these victory objectives away from Japan. They could even threaten Japan itself with the transports and these units they have here in Wake. And they bought 3 more transports with 3 medium armor and 3 infantry in San Francisco. So the Japanese are going to probably have to start thinking about putting some defenses in Tokyo, although I wouldn't be surprised to see Japan use their Navy to take out this threat here in Wake. That's more significant, I think, than the U.S. fleet here in the South Pacific. This fleet with all these ground units here in Wake are an actual threat to Tokyo. So I can see the Japanese, who knows, they might even roll the dice and try to split their fleet up and take out both of these U.S. fleets here. We'll see how that plays out here on turn number 20. Other than that, the victory objectives are still 13 for the Axis, 6 for the Allies, and 8 for the Comintern. So the Axis still have a pretty significant lead. Although, again, Japan is definitely starting to feel the pressure. I think the problem with Japan is they didn't take out any one opponent in the Pacific. And now, from the Far East Command to the Communist Chinese to the U.S. to the Australians, all of them are kind of a little bit rejuvenated and coming at Japan all at once now. So each turn the game goes on, Japan is feeling the crunch, and Italy definitely could be in some significant danger if the game goes a couple more turns. We'll see what happens after turn number 20.